Hi, my name is Bob Carroll. I'm the host of PSLabor Talk, and today we're going to be talking about marijuana in the workplace. With so many states legalizing marijuana and legalizing medical marijuana, exactly how do employers deal with this difficult subject? I'm joined today by Cliff Hammond of Foster Swift and Ricardo Torres, President and CEO of Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants, where we discuss different ways that employers can deal with this very sensitive subject. It's a subject that's growing, and it's something that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And I'm sure as you're listening, you're eager to hear how to protect yourself from the hazards in the workplace associated with not just marijuana, but other drugs, alcohol, and the opioid addiction crisis. And you may even be a listener that advocates for marijuana and owns a business, but has never really thought it through and how you actually need to take your personal views aside in the workplace and protect yourself and your the people that work for you. We have a very interesting topic today, and welcome to today's episode of PSLabor Talk.
Hey, yeah, let's talk about this, man. Because I just looked at this last night. Because Bob just sent it to me about a day ago. You know, so, but some of it was interesting. Some of it, what I'm seeing that, you know, and like I said, I didn't have a lot of time to really delve into it. But from seeing it, I think a lot of and tell me if I'm wrong, and you always do, but but there's a lot of overriding between state and federal laws, or state laws with this, and state laws with the new the law that got approved in different state laws. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of
tremendous amount of confusion.
Yeah.
Imagine, think about it from this standpoint. Imagine one day there's a bunch of people in Michigan, and they say, listen, we've got a whole bunch of people that need money, and we got a lot of people that have money.
Yeah.
And we don't think it's fair that people are dying or just don't have the money to pay for things and necessities. So we think that we should be able to rob banks so that we can get money. Because you know what? They're FDIC insured. Everybody's going to be fine. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get all the laws off the books to say that we're going to enforce bank robbery because we need to be able to distribute some of this money out there. That wouldn't be much different than what we've got right here. We've got states saying we're not going to enforce any law that has to do with something that is clearly illegal as a federal
mandate.
A
federal law, yeah.
And that's exactly what we got.
And federal laws always upend, state laws.
And they do here.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's always that concept of when the federal government comes in and they make a law, that law trumps all other laws, except where the Constitution says it doesn't. So the bottom line here is, this is a very simple interstate commerce issue. What is going on with drugs? These particular drugs, including marijuana, are illegal for almost every purpose, if not every purpose, Schedule 1. And then the states have come out and said, you know what, we don't think this works. We think there's a reason to go ahead and go in a different direction, so we're not going to enforce it. In fact, we're going to make it illegal to do things against people if they use this drug or they sell this drug in these quantities. It actually is unbelievable that the states are doing this right now, because it's almost like a revolution.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's a small scale.
Well, isn't Michigan making it? Because I know it's different than there's more protections in some of the laws, like in the eastern states, like Jersey, and in other states, Vermont.
Well, there's several states that have actually made. We have different civil rights codes. And what some of the courts in the East Coast have said recently is that when you test positive for a drug, what you're going to get is you're going to get the right to be able, as an employee, to have a reasonable accommodation. And if you don't go through with that, then you've violated actually our civil rights codes. Now, Michigan hasn't done that. They've actually just passed this standalone kind of concept. But it actually applied across to employers and said employers had to go through certain steps before they could say, no, you can't have an accommodation. So that's different.
Well, tell me something. Now, the bill that passed in Michigan, that's not for casual use. That's for medical use, right?
No, the bill that there was a medical marijuana statute that was on the board.
And this one is for casual use.
Now, the next step was just legalizing recreational use.
Yes.
And they have, obviously, everything has contours and limits. But that's what this is. This is going the next step, saying it doesn't matter if you have a medical condition. You can just use it, period. And as long as you're not
Within
doing,
reasons, yeah.
within reasons,
Yeah.
you can't go out and do it in public.
Well, you can only grow so much. You can, I mean,
Right,
it's basically taking it to where like it's alcohol.
It's taking it close to alcohol. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, it's not to alcohol's limit,
Right.
but it's trying to make a middle ground between saying, if you're a big time drug dealer, you're not going to be able to make any money off of this most likely.
Yeah.
But if you go through the applicable rules, you can start selling to people who use it recreationally on a small scale on their own. And if you're a person who wants to grow, manufacture, and sell on a small scale, you can get licensed and you can do it. And if you just want to use it for your own personal use,
Yeah.
they're not going to go ahead and make it criminal.
Within limitations.
Yeah.
I mean, like you can sell it if it's like an ounce and a half or something like that.
Not yet.
Well, the problem is that
When it's implemented.
when it's implemented. So right now it's legal to actually purchase it.
Yeah.
But the problem is they haven't put all the regulations in place to be able to get the licenses out for people to sell under this new. So the question is, there's a gap period between now
Yeah.
and 2020 when we're going to go live with people actually selling this thing. So where do you get it from? I don't know. Do you get it from your neighbor? Do you get it from your dispensary if you have a medical marijuana card? Do you get it for yourself because you can start growing up to 12 pot plants on your own?
Yeah.
And so you can have up to 10 ounces in your house of this stuff at any time. And you're allowed to have that, maintain it, and if friends come over and get it, they're not going to come in your house and bust down your door if you're giving to them 2.5 ounces on your person anytime they find you.
Yeah.
You're fine. So you're going to have this small scale exchange rate going on, whether it's in your house or on the street.
Well, aren't federal laws going to have to change? Is banking laws going to have to change?
Well, right now everything's cash.
Yeah.
So the odd thing about this is this whole industry has grown, not just here, but we see it in the West Coast. You see it in Colorado and California where they started doing this. And what they do is, as a federal mandate, I mean, this is illegal. I mean, this is drug running, drug dealing. And so in the state of Michigan right now, if you're a medical marijuana grower, everything's cash based. So I have an employee. Let's say I run a dispensary and I do medical marijuana. I've got to pay my employees cash. And I got to pay taxes in cash because I can't do banking. I'm not allowed to. The federal government, if the federal government wants to actually get involved with this, if they actually want to partake in a lot of these taxes that might be lost because who knows how the numbers are getting done, yeah, they probably would have to change it. But the federal government has said, we're not behind this.
Well,
right
is
now.
it in Denver? Aren't they allowing because of credit unions to allowing them to do some business transactions?
Every state
with
has a
credit
different way
unions?
of approaching it. But
Yeah.
again, from a federal standpoint,
Yeah.
if you're selling drugs, Schedule 1
Yeah.
illegal illicit drugs, taking that money, putting it in the bank, you could be subject to seizure. In fact, the oddest thing about every one of these states is, let's say you're a licensed seller and you want to sell this drugs. And you go out and you go through the bureaucracy, you sign up, you put your name on there, you put whoever your business is and your address. What you're really doing is at any time, if the federal government really wanted to, they could just go down to the state and say, give me that list. And just start showing up one by one and arresting every one of those guys.
Well,
and
not
finding them.
only that, I know there was a law in Michigan where it changed as far as how they have to if they want to take away property and things because of
Sure.
drug use. I mean, how would that fall into this also? I mean, are they going to be able to do it? I mean, now there has to be a conviction before they can. They can.
Well,
they
but-
can take it, but then before they can actually use it.
Well, if the ATF comes on your door, or the
Yeah.
Department of Justice, or any type of federal agency comes in, they don't have to listen to Michigan's rules.
Right.
And that's what always comes
Right.
back to play is Michigan can change all the rules and all the laws it wants, and it can enforce
Yeah.
it however it wants to. But now, I'm not saying they should or they could and not have repercussions
Yeah.
because the federal government at any time could come in and say, look,
Right.
because
well,
of this, you're
Jeff
gonna lose
Jeff
contracts.
Sessions when he was
Attorney General.
Attorney General, yeah, he was talking about enforcing the federal laws,
Yeah.
which would negate any.
Well, the thing was that Obama, when he was president, had basically signaled that, look, I'm not going to go out and rough people up individually or businesses up individually if they're complying with a state mandated legislative effort. So if they legalize recreational marijuana, if they legalize medical marijuana, and a person or a consumer or a business goes ahead and complies, they signaled that they probably wouldn't be coming. It wasn't a priority for them to do it. When Sessions comes in, and I think consistent with the old laws, what the law really is they said, look, if you're breaking the law, you're breaking the law, and we're going to come after you because we're not going to make, it doesn't make sense for us to have this patchwork of, well, you cross this line, the federal government law will change. You want a federal government law that actually applies for everybody, and that's what but what happened was you didn't see this rush to enforcement in California. You didn't see this rush to enforcement because probably it cost too much money to do. I mean, and pragmatically, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. You get more pushback, more, I guess, hurdles to cross, and it was good. And they're waiting to see how big this is.
And you may have local and state enforcement agencies not cooperating with the feds also. So it can get really confusing. Where it really gets confusing, and it's confusing on that level, but where it really can get confusing is now with employees or employers.
To clear some things up right now, because we're talking to people from every state. We're talking about the state of Michigan right now, though, right?
Right. Michigan's the newest.
The newest state, right.
But similar issues happen all through the country.
You also have to remember that individual municipalities have a right to put a kibosh on that as well, correct?
Sure. I mean, for dispensaries and things of that nature, and who sells and who's a licensed salesperson, but the municipality can't stop, under Michigan's law, an individual from growing up to 12 marijuana plants in their own home, possessing 10 ounces in their home, and carrying 2.5 ounces around. That type of regulation has been taken away from any municipality by the state.
Because state law overrides the local.
Exactly. I think one of the biggest tests of that law that people are already pushing the limits is you can gift 2.5 ounces of marijuana. So now we already have shops that are giving you a gift bag that happens to come with you buy the bag worth about 99 cents, pay $50 for it, you get your 2.5 ounces of marijuana. And I know that's happening in 2 cities right now that I saw on the news, and I'm sure there's more popping up.
Sure.
And it's going to become easier and easier for people to get marijuana. And we're not just talking about marijuana.
Well, it's always been easy for people to get marijuana.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, semi-legal marijuana.
Yeah. And we're also talking about opioids, and what we really want to hit on is what's happening in the workplace. What does this new law have to do with the workplace, Cliff?
Well, it's got to do everything with how employers approach off-work use of drugs, whether they be marijuana, or whether they be methamphetamine, or whether they be opiates, or the abuse of painkillers, whatever they are. Employers are always dealing with 2 issues. One, employees, they're people, and they come from every walk of life and every different position and mentality on what their approach is to alcohol or drugs. And then secondly, controlling your workplace so that you can be healthy and safe. One of the things that under President Obama, what we saw was he actually insisted on cracking down on workplaces to make sure they were safe. So you saw OSHA take a pretty aggressive approach on what employers could and couldn't do for their work rules, even trying to say that requiring somebody to have a post-accident drug test just because they were in an accident might actually infringe on their right under OSHA. So they basically were making rules to say you have to be very careful on how you approach drug testing in the first place. On the other hand, they were also saying if you're a certain federal contractor, if you get federal funds, you're required to do certain drug testing. You have to have a safe drug workplace because we don't want you to jump the gun on every single person if there's just an accident where a machine breaks and hits somebody, had nothing to do with them. On the other hand, we do think as a whole we should have safe places to work, and we do want you to drug test if you're getting federal funds. Then you have people who are truck drivers. You have people who have CDL licenses. The federal government requires those individuals to have drug testing. If you're going to work on certain types of industries, you have to have drug testing. Marijuana is going to be included. So you've had this push and pull from the previous administration on, we want to relax casual drug use, but at the same time, we want to have a safe workplace. And so now we move into this.
Well, but employers still have the right to dictate because of all those issues you were bringing up, because of safety issues, because of people who are working on machinery. I mean, it can be hazardous to the employees, the general employees. So they have to have the ability to control their workforce. I mean, it's
that's
the same.
the biggest problem, though.
Yeah.
Rick. I mean, I'll tell you, the biggest problem that employers have is that there are conflicting positions on this issue by the same people. The same people who advocate for the use of marijuana, who believe that that's your personal decision, what you do in your private life. Why are we criminalizing something that's better for whatever reason? You fill out the blank of all the reasons why, versus the safety of others in a workplace. And the federal government has gone out and really they've tried to, in the last probably 8 years to 10 years, they've really tried to make workplaces safe, make the roads safe, make people not be subject to unsafe workplaces. On the other hand, they also are trying to say, well, it's okay to use certain drugs and have a drug test. So how do you do that balance? Because those are not the same issue. One is I can do whatever I want to do, and the other one is no, you can't. You've got to be drug tested. And what actually happens is you get into what an employer really needs, which is they have a right to protect their workplace if they do it the right way. And
Well, and that's not targeting like marijuana or other drugs. It's targeting actions or results of accidents.
Well, not necessarily. That's the problem, because the drug-free workplace acts that have been put in place by the federal government, they don't exempt marijuana and they don't exempt prior use. And as we may talk about here in a little bit, the technology for testing certain drugs is better than others. But whether or not you're actually under the influence, whether you actually pose a danger. So, for instance, marijuana right now, we see several states going into these new testing programs where they're trying to get the technology to say when is a person under the influence. Because unlike alcohol, we can take a blood alcohol test and we can pretty clearly say you are either under the influence or you're not. But marijuana is one of those drugs where they have an odd response. You have this real steep increase in the level of THC in your system, and then it decreases really rapidly, but you actually might be more impaired when your THC is lower. And then a person who's, depending on your body type, depending on the use, you could have it stored in certain areas of your system for long periods of time. And so they're trying to find out the technology so that employers know when the person's under the influence or not. But it's not there yet. I mean, we're trying to get there. We're not getting there. So the question always comes, a person says, I've got it in my system. They work for you. You test them because, one, you're required federally, or two, you just decide as an employer you want to do it so you can screen out people who are dangerous pre-employment or during the employment, 4 calls or just random. How do you know when to fire the person? How do you know when to give them a second? How do you know they're under the influence? And these are the questions that a lot of employers are trying to struggle with right now is, what do I do with my testing? How do I know? And the technology isn't 100% there yet. It's getting better, but that's the big question with medical marijuana. That's been going in many of these states with the recreational use of marijuana. No state has required yet that an employer has to allow an employee to go just do drugs, whether it be marijuana, opiates, on work site. That's not safe. That's not going to happen.
Well, they even put in, as far as cigarette smoking or tobacco use, they're putting restrictions on it. I know there's places that will monitor if someone has participated in taking tobacco products, and as far as their health care and co-pays and stuff like that, But how do you write a handbook or a policy to handle that? I mean, I think that's an important question.
Well, it depends on where you're at. So, for instance, in Michigan, it's really simple. The law is very clear, the new law. It says that employers are free to go ahead and have a handbook policy or any type of drug-free work policy that says that you can be let go or fired under a normal drug testing program or if you're under the influence. So this law, as written, is very clear, and it's consistent with the Colorado and the California laws that allows employers to control their workplace just like they did before.
But does it change if you have a medical card? I mean, I don't even know if a medical card is necessary anymore. But if you have a medical card saying that this is because of a physical problem that I have,
well, in some states,
doesn't that fall? I mean, I don't know about.
Well, the medical card right now, until especially in Michigan, the medical card is the way you get your majority of people are still going to get
right. But aren't you more
legally
protected though? Are you more protected? I mean, it's just like if you're taking any other medicine that could impair you from driving machinery or operating machinery.
So there's a case out of the 6th Circuit which covers Michigan and Ohio and a number of other states, and it was a case where Walmart had an employee, and the individual indicated that they had a medical marijuana card. They tested positive, and Walmart said, I really don't care. And the individual's position was that I have a disability, And when I take this drug, it's not because I'm out there just getting high because it's my right and I'm recreating. They said, no, I need this because medically, if I don't have this, it's a problem for me. So I'm using this as an accommodation. And I'm not unhealthy. I'm not somebody who's under the influence when I'm coming to work. I just took a drug test. All I want the ability to do is be able to use my medical marijuana card from my healthcare provider who prescribed this to me, even though it's a Schedule I illegal drug federally. They prescribed it. I got it legally. I want to be able to use it. And Walmart said, that's not reasonable for me to have to allow you to break federal law. And the court said, you're right. Even though there is a federal law that says, and states have similar laws as well, that you have to give somebody a reasonable accommodation if they have a disability. Under a lot of reasons, they would have to do that. But here they said allowing a person to test positive for a Schedule I federally legal drug, marijuana, you don't have to accommodate that. And so right now, in that state it is. But there are other states where they're looking at their rules and how they look at it, and they might say you have to go a little bit further. You actually might have to put a policy in where you do the interactive system. You can't just say you tested positive, you're out. So we have to watch it because those are different rules and different laws placed in their civil rights codes, and that actually could change the way you have to address it. But from an employer standpoint, I think what you do is you treat marijuana like you would anything else. You test for a drug. If the drug test is positive, you go back to the person, you go through the system, and you disqualify them, generally speaking, like you would anybody else for any other type of drug. And if they have a medical marijuana card, you go through the same system as if the person had opiates. But in Michigan specifically, you don't have to right now. An employer is free to have the same policy they've always had. You test positive for one of these 5-panel tests, whatever's in there, including marijuana. You test positive, you're subject to whatever. Whether it means go to an employee assistance program until you get yourself certified and come back to work. You get yourself on a last chance. You get the person terminated or they don't get employment. Whatever you have done in the past, you're fine to continue to do.
Well, that's the thing about it is it has to be based on your past practice. Mm-hmm. You can't create new rules.
No. Well, I mean, if you don't have a rule, you should put a rule in place.
If you don't have it, right, and there's no legal obligation to have a handbook, but it's good to have a handbook because it sets policy.
Let's talk about this. Let's say you have an employee who gets hurt on the job, and then they go down and they test positive for marijuana. Now that person goes and files for workers' comp. Now the question's always going to be, if you let the person go, did you do it because they tested for marijuana, or did you do it, or cocaine, or whatever it is, or did you do it because they did a work comp claim? You've always got to have a policy. And if everybody else who got hurt, they said no big deal.
And they can't do it if it's a work comp claim. Is that correct?
Well, you can if they actually violate the policy.
But if you fire someone, but if it's shown that you're doing it in retaliation for having a work comp claim, can you still go ahead and do it?
Well, again, if you have a consistent policy and you have a policy that says if you test positive for fill in the blank drugs, and you have fired people or you've terminated. Or
the flip side of that coin is have you enforce that policy.
Yeah, so you need two things to be able to prove it. One, you need a policy. Yeah. One, your policy has to be clear, has to articulate what the consequences are, has to articulate what's going to happen. Two, you got to enforce it because you can have all the policies in the world. All the paper in the world isn't going to help you if you give John and Joe and Susie a break. Right. But then next thing you know, I'm the one who not only tested positive, but I also made a claim against you. And that person's going to say, no, you didn't do this because I tested positive. You did it because I filed a work comp claim. Yeah. Then you got yourself in a problem. So that's where you need policies that are clear, articulated, and enforced properly. Now, you can always change them, but you've got to be careful.
So regardless if they can prove it, and that would be a heck of a hurdle to jump over to prove that someone was discriminatory against you because you filed a claim. It still is within, in Michigan anyways, within their legal rights to fire you.
Yeah, generally speaking. Again, every fact is different, but when you have history, you've got policy. In Michigan's no different in most states. Every state's a little bit different in their work comp laws, but in Michigan specifically, generally speaking, you are allowed to have a policy. You're allowed to terminate. The person could always try to say it's because of this. You've got to have something to fight back on. And if you have a consistent practice, that's a lot easier to say it's non-discriminatory.
Yeah, and one of the issues that Bob knows that we've had with handling a lot of these situations is that people don't have these in their handbook. They don't have recreational drugs
or,
and stuff.
or worse, they have it and they don't follow it.
They don't follow it, yeah.
And
In fact, actually, that is worse. Yeah.
Even the supervisors are high, and what precedence does that set?
Yeah,
Sure.
We've had real cases with that where, with everything from drugs to firearms to all kinds of stuff. People don't put these in there. Either they don't have handbooks, or they don't keep the handbooks up to date, or they don't enforce the handbooks or the rules.
We just had a pretty big case during a union campaign, where I would say about 50% of that workforce was indeed high. Several of them freely admitted it. They had a hard time getting rid of any of those people. First of all, key people in that company also enjoyed to.
Is that the one, Bob, where the supervisors were actually going out and buying the?
No.
Okay.
No, that was a different one.
Okay. There's a number of them that
they were going out and buying beer though. That wasn't marijuana.
Right.
But to me, it's the same difference. Yeah. They're putting stuff in the employees' bodies that's making it dangerous. I'll tell you, I was walking through this warehouse, and I was scared to be in that warehouse. And I wasn't afraid because I was in there on any union issue. I was afraid because I was in there and they were driving these high-lows, high on marijuana. And you may say marijuana has no effect, but I'm telling you, when you're in those warehouses and they're on any kind of substance, driving those high-lows the way they were driving it, there was clear and present danger. Yeah. We did eventually pull one of them because somebody caught him, basically ratted him out, said he was out in the car, he was afraid for his life. I know what he felt like, and wanted it addressed. We were able to take care of the situation because the employee did admit it and did ask to go home.
See, that's exactly what the problem has been from most people's standpoint, is even the advocates of marijuana use understand for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there's a zealot here or there, but for the most part, they understand you're on a work site, you're on a job site, if you're running machinery, you cannot be under the influence. You cannot be under the influence of some sort of mind altering or slowing down of your mental process, or you can hurt people or kill them. It's that simple. You're walking around, someone's in a high-low, they run over top of you because reflexes are slow, you get hurt. They're not trying to stop that. That's why when you go into, say you're an iron worker and you want to work on a work site that's a federal project, that's why they do drug testing. They've got to make sure the individuals that are there can test negative for any of these drugs, so they don't have to worry about it until or unless somebody gets killed. Then they do a post-accident screen. They don't want a post-accident screen. They want a pre-screen to screen out people who pose threats. That's the big issue.
Yeah, and you're talking about a lot of lawsuits too. I mean, the thing about with marijuana is that there's so many unknowns. I mean, just like some information that you passed on to us, Cliff, was like, for example, opium abuse costs employers approximately $10 billion annually. Mm-hmm. And in healthcare, with healthcare costs, it comes up to almost $20 billion annually. That could, affect whether a company is going to stay open or close their doors. I mean, it's a lot of money, and we don't know where this is going to go. I mean, there's a lot of uncharted territory in with marijuana use. It's just going to pile onto those costs that already exist with other drugs.
Yeah, the marijuana issue is a drop in the bucket compared to opiates. I think that sometimes we talk about it, but then it gets swept under the rug pretty quickly. This is an epidemic that's hurting employers just as much as it is, I guess, anybody else.
Yeah, but it piggybacks on other issues, as far like opium or other drugs. It piggybacks on that, to make it, the cost of doing business much, much more.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the studies and the surveys, they're pretty consistent. People who are addicted to substances use sick days more often. They're absent from work more often. They have a higher incidence of workers' compensation claims than any other group that's not addicted to substances. So whether or not marijuana use now, because it's open and it's available more often, does it have an uptick or not, it's not really the issue. The issue really is if you are addicted to some substance or you're utilizing a substance that's now going to affect your ability, your decision-making ability, will that again create another uptick? And so employers have to think about it. A lot of employers say, listen, the economy is pretty good right now, okay? And that's a reality. Now, what does that mean? For most employers, what that means is I've got to get bodies in the door to do jobs. There's certain skilled trades where you've seen for years they don't have enough people in there. So they've been fighting hard to say, can we just water down these drug tests? Do I have to give them for a pre-screen? Can I just wait until afterwards? Because why? Because I got to get people through the door. But rank and file guys, the guys who don't have a skilled trade, where I just need a person in there and I can train them within a week or 2 weeks or a month or two and get them ready to go, they're more interchangeable. And when the economy's bad, guess what? You can screen anybody. You can get the top of the top. The person's not going to work. But when the economy's hot, like it has been, and you're fighting and wages are rising, a lot of employers are like, look, can I get rid of these drug tests for these guys? I can't keep people. They're jumping for better jobs, whatever. Can I just get rid of it? And I say, well, that's, poison you got to keep.
Well, one question, too, I have for you, Cliff. Say, for instance, someone, a company has it in their handbook, is specifically how they drug test their employees. They say, okay, it's a tight market, so we have to, you'll be a little bit flexible. So they're flexible. They have their rules and regulations, their handbooks. They're flexible. The economy slows down. All of a sudden, they have more options as far as who they can bring in, and then they try to tighten up the drug testing. So, so how can they change that? Is that going to have an effect on them also? Wait a minute, before you let me get away with this, now you're not. Past practice.
That's a problem that comes up all the time. The economy ebbs and flows. It goes ups and down, and companies want to change the rules. There's nothing in the law right now that says, unless you have a federal contract, unless you have a contract with a supplier or a vendor that says you have to do testing. Some people do, so you can't waiver.
But I'm talking about as far as discipline.
Well, that's the whole point. Let's just say you have nothing that stops you from doing it. You always can interchange. Yeah. Okay, we have a policy that says we have to test. Then everything slows down. We say, okay, now we're not going to test. We're going to go back and forth. The problem is you've let 50 people come in when the economy was hot and you were trying to get people in here, and all of them would have flunked the drug test. Now you change your policy. Now, how are you going to apply this policy? Are you going to be able to? Are you now going to have all these people get into incidents and then fire them, and then you're going to weed out the people coming through? You're going to have an inherent problem on the workforce.
Or maybe they never changed the policy; they just stopped enforcing the policy, right, which is a whole nother problem. Yeah.
And I think that causes the workplace issue. I think that you have to have a policy that you want as your core.
Yeah.
So whenever you don't have a value system as a corporate value as to what it is that you need to get a person qualified, then jumping back and forth, ignoring a policy today, but enforcing it tomorrow, that causes inherent problems on the workforce because people don't trust that there's any consistency. And that causes lots of issues within the company. And because you have people who believe in that, they don't believe in it, but when you waffle yourself without any legitimate good faith reason, it causes issues.
Well, then workers also have the legitimate, question, is there favoritism going on
here? Are you doing
also?
It now because of this?
Yeah. Right, absolutely. Yeah. You're doing it now because, I'm Hispanic. You're doing it now because, I filed a charge against you. It could be 1,000 different reasons.
Well, yeah, let's say you have a majority white workforce. You're in a rural area. You're just starting up a manufacturing set. And most of the people that came to work when you opened it up, they were all white males, maybe some white females, but mostly a white male workforce. Then all of a sudden you start to grow a little bit, and then you decide, okay, we've had this system. We never really did it. We had this cool handbook that had all these nice bells and whistles. But now that we're growing and we're starting to attract more people from farther away, let's start enforcing it. And the first 5 applicants that test positive and don't get a job happen to be African American. Well, guess what? They're going to say, wait a minute. Every single person who walked through this door, you had the exact same policy. Yeah. All of a sudden, those white employees didn't have to get tested.
Legitimately,
right.
They're going to question that. And that's the whole problem. And in fact, tell me how many times you encounter this, Cliff, to where people stop enforcing policies that they've made without changing it. I mean, that's where the real problem comes in, because they change a policy or they stop enforcing a policy, and then later on they say, well, we're going to start, enforcing it again, and then you run into all kinds of problems without changing the actual policy.
Yeah, it happens a lot. It happens a lot for all policies. I don't think there's any policy that's more or less than this. Attendance is just as flip-floppy as an alcohol and drug testing policy. I mean, you'll see attendance policy be waived for one person versus another, and then it gets you in trouble down that you have one department not doing something when another department doesn't. And drug policies are just like that. The problem with the drug policy is that usually you don't just have somebody being disciplined. Usually those end in discharge.
Yes.
Now, I will say that one of the things that people kind of get carried away with is
Or accidents.
Right? The post-accident drug
Yeah.
screen, and when do we send, when we don't send, how do you send is another issue. So when you're coming up with your policies, one of the biggest problems that you always have is, let's just say Johnny gets in an accident, and you think Johnny's under the influence. You take a look at Johnny. Here's what employers do. Say, Johnny, you need to go down for a drug test down at the local clinic, and Johnny drives himself down for a drug test.
There you go. You can't. You can't let him drive. You can't let him drive if you suspect that he's under the influence.
Yeah.
And he gets into an accident on the way to get a drug test, then you have it's a whole nother issue.
But how many times have we seen that?
Oh, all the time. All the time.
That's something that gets under my skin quite a bit, because literally that same job that I was just talking about earlier, I went to use the restroom. When I got out, the employee was gone. I said, "Where's the employee?" "Well, we sent him home." "Well, how'd he get home?" "He got in his car and left." Oh my gosh, the feeling that came over me about this manager, and this guy really cared about his employees. If you remember the case, he cared about his employees. He did not want this employee gone. And when the employee was not on drugs, he was a top performing employee. And that's another thing that we forgot to mention. What about the effects of productivity when you're using marijuana or opioids in the workplace? It goes down.
I mean, the law's not going to. A law's going to change it to a certain extent, where people have the legal right for, to use it as recreational drugs. But, I mean, let's face the facts. People are going to work now, with, after smoking pot or
they've been
or
doing it
something
for
else.
years.
They've always been doing it.
But I think that's part of the problem, that this law doesn't address the employment situation that we've all dealt with. And here's what it is. People drink. It's been legal since Prohibition was repealed, and it might be less of an issue now on a day-to-day basis for DUIs because they've criminally cracked down on that. But from an employer standpoint, whether you do drugs at home, whether you are an alcoholic or a functioning alcoholic, whatever it is, you as an employer have to create a safe workplace. If people in employment situations, a boss, a person who makes decisions, decides, hey, I'm an advocate for marijuana, and they put that hat on, and they forget that at the end of the day, they've got a duty to protect the third parties that come on their property, the other employees there, and they ignore those realities, they're going to get sued. People are going to get hurt. People could be killed. So you've got to stop looking at it, and I talk to people a lot of times, stop looking at it as to whether or not you agree or don't agree with whether marijuana should be legal or not, or whether people are doing it and have been doing it. What you got to look at is, what as a company do we need to do to make sure that we're safe? That's it. Just keep it focused like that. And whether you think that doing marijuana is good or bad, we can all agree being high while on the job is not good and should be prohibited.
Right, absolutely. And what's confusing is because different states have different rules and regulations, and how this and if a company has multiple sites in multiple states, it might fall under different regulations or different laws. But how does this affect? Especially with, up in the air, the joint employer situation is up in the air right now. I mean, it's all over the place. How does this affect temp companies also?
Sure.
Who may have one rule, and the workplace where the employees of the temp company go have another rule. Protect, this could be a cluster, and to protect for the company to protect themselves from a joint employer ruling also. How much of an effect or control do they have over the temp workers?
Yeah, and this has always been the issue. Who controls what the employees have to have? I see this being a bigger problem because a lot of companies will tell the temp companies, look, we don't want anybody, you can do whatever you want, you can control, but we don't want anybody who tests positive for drugs, just like we don't want somebody who's had a felony or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Once you start putting those mandates in place, you start getting closer and closer to being a joint employer.
Yes.
And the joint employer status for that person can implicate you in a lot of different things.
Right.
Whether that person sues under your state law, the civil rights law of that particular state, or they sue you, another employee sues you because that temp did those things and you didn't control it enough, or you controlled it too much. So do you become a joint employer? I think when you go into this thing, you have to understand that when you reach out to a employment agency, you want to make sure you have a reputable employment agency, number one. There are a lot of employment agencies that are out there. The question is, how are they going to be able to get you results? So you got to shop around, make sure they're reputable. Do they do their own testing? The more you control what they do, the more you have to be involved with that situation, the more likely you are to become a joint employer. That's a risk. It might be a calculated risk, but it's something you need to know what you're getting yourself
Well,
into.
understanding their policies and their practices is one thing, and dictating policies and practices for the workers that come over to work for your company is another thing. And that's where you find the thin line.
All right?
Yeah, if I'm a non-union company, I own a non-union company.
Sure.
And I don't have anything in my handbook about drugs or marijuana, opiates, can I visit an attorney like you, have my handbook reviewed, have provisions added, and implement it?
Yes.
If I'm a union company, is it that easy?
No.
Why?
Well, first and foremost, drug policies are a mandatory subject of bargaining, and under the law, before you implement it, you have to do one of two things. You either, one, have to give up that right through bargaining. The union has to say, you can go ahead and make your own work policies and make your own work rules and do your own drug testing specifically. Or you got to sit down at the table and bargain with the union about what's the appropriate level of, not only one, what's the testing, but two, what happens if you do test positive?
So my question for both of you, because Rick, you were a high-level union official, many years in the union. You were a union side attorney at one point before you came over to represent management. What union in their right mind would condone not letting that kind of provision get into a handbook?
When I was a union official, we would fight any charge for anything that happened, unless it was someone, a severe accident in the workplace. I mean, and then we would still defend the worker. But as far as drug testing and alcohol testing, any kind of drug testing, substance abuse, we would fight, extremely hard.
But would they
to
have the
protect them.
audacity to use that as a trading chip for something else?
Absolutely.
In a second. In fact, there's no sacred cows when it comes to the union getting what it wants. There's no sacred cows.
What about the concept of safety and unions pushing for safety and
Well, the safety and the safety,
Well, that's about right. Yeah. I mean, you think about it for a second. From the union standpoint, their job is to protect the interests of the employees. Now, obviously, everybody is safe from a union standpoint when there aren't people that are being subjected to people under the influence. And the union would generally say, we don't have a problem if a person's under the influence, if they test positive for being under the influence, for that person being subject to discipline. But what they would say is, the problem with marijuana is, how do you know the person's under the influence?
But even in a situation to where it's alcohol, where it's easily
That's where I was
proven,
gonna go.
and that's what I'm talking about. I mean, the discipline is the word. What is discipline?
What is the law?
Yeah, I mean discipline and what we fought for when I was back on the other side, when I was a union official, and what we tried to get our locals to fight for was to, discipline was, having some time off and going to a facility that will help you, stop drinking and to give them discipline. But second chance letters, third chance letters, those were the things that keep people on the jobs and not to get them fired. That was the main thing. And what was discipline was not being, we always thought, unless it was severe cases to where they violated the second and third, letters. But our remedy for these situations was always, hey, let's give them some treatment, let's give them another chance, let's always work with the company to keep them on the job.
And that's the argument that still goes. I mean,
Yeah.
that's exactly what's bargained all the time. Yes, we'll agree to a safety program, but we're also talking about what should we do to help this person who is, let's say they're an alcoholic, let's say that they're dependent on drugs. Why are you going to throw them in the street? The worst thing the union could think of in their mind is having an employee who has a problem being fired for having a problem. In their opinion, that's an opportunity to work with the person, not an opportunity to discipline them. So what they would say is, sure, we'll agree, but you have to go through 4, 5, 6 steps, give them a EAP, and an employee assistance program, a treatment facility. Once they get that, they come back to work, and then they're good to go. And if it happens a second time, that's too bad. Let's do it again if it's in this certain period of time. I mean, That's the difference between a non-union and union facility.
Even after last chance letters.
Yes.
Even after last chance letters, what I mean? I mean, throw that last chance letter out the window. We want them to have another last chance, letter. I mean, the thing about it was to push it as much as possible, and I must say also was to really try to get the guy some help. In cases that I personally know of.
And I've had a lot of those arbitrations,
right? Yeah,
where the person there's a policy in place, it was properly negotiated with the union, or it was put in place by the employer, and the union agreed to allow them to put their own policy in, however strict they wanted it. But when the person was disciplined under the policy, they would grieve the policy and say, "Look, we don't have a problem with the policy. We don't have a problem with you disciplining the person. What we got a problem is we don't think that the punishment of termination fits the crime.
Right.
You got a 15-year employee with a
Yeah.
spotless work
Yeah.
record. They have one bad day, one bad issue, one bad test.
And that's where the give and take comes into place. That's where the give and take comes into place.
that-
Well, we won't do this if you do that. That's where the give and take comes place, and that's why the gray area comes in place too. Well, how do you discipline someone next month for something else? What do you do? But that's where it gets confusing. But that's a give and take. And it all depends on the status of the employee also.
And that happened back in the days of the liquid lunch, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, liquid lunch you could prove. You could do a breath test. on somebody.
But many times it wasn't enforced. And I tell you what, again, I mean, just like Michigan and other states that are right to work states, where that give and take comes, falls into place. If a union official wouldn't fight as hard, for that give and take if the worker wasn't paying dues. They wouldn't be that give and take. Well, if you don't, the crime doesn't fit the punishment. Well, hey, it's on record. We negotiated. It is what it is. So that's once again. I mean, these are issues that there's laws that you have to defend the worker just like you would someone who was paying dues. But there's defend and there's defend, and there's still gray area out there. No matter how much they try to put that in writing and set a standard, there's still always going to be that gray area.
My point is, though, you can prove without a benefit of a doubt, you can prove that somebody is drunk. When somebody is high, even the police are having trouble figuring out ways to prove this.
Well, they're putting policies in place. What they're doing in say, Colorado, for instance, is
5 nanograms per milligram.
Well, they have that, but they also are looking at observable behaviors.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go.
And so that's what a lot of employers are doing now. Is there is a for-cause testing component that you do before you send a person out for the screen sometimes. And what you can do is there are identifiable things that have been put together by state police departments and different agencies to say you have verified observable behavior. You have another person watch that individual. You put those into your policy, and that's how you determine whether.
But what standards do the people who observe those policies? What standards do they have to meet?
Well,
I mean, that's the question. Do they have to have training? Is there specific training that they have to be able to observe those standards?
So I was at a HR roundtable the other day, and I was in a group conversation, and there was a member there from a drug testing company. And one of the things that he brought up is that they get calls in the middle of the night to come in and do testing on employees. Oddly enough, the client was the union because they wanted to have that definitive proof. But what they also do that I think a lot of companies should be aware is they will come in and they will teach your management those signs that Cliff was just talking about, almost like a police officer knows the signs, so that you have reasonable cause to send them for testing to put them through the process.
But are there
Right.
standards? Are there standards that a company that teaches these things have to meet before they can train, and that could be upheld in court?
But there aren't any federal laws on what it has to be.
Well, federal laws. The federal laws aren't going to matter because federal laws, these are illegal drugs anyways. I mean,
Well, but there's differences, and so, for instance, if you're stopped, and again, it's not federal, but from a state version, if somebody is stopped, police will usually do an observation to see whether the person appears to be impaired, and they've gone through and vetted through research and studies what those should be, and that's generally what these companies will do. The testing companies will do. They'll look at the same material, the same testing, because they are the ones who and generally will help train the police in a lot of cases on these things. And they'll come to employers and they'll train managers. Now, again, the problem with doing that is you may not have time, you may not have the resources, you may not have the money, you may not even want to do it. So whether it's effective or not, I mean, that goes into the individu who's taking the test or being trained.
And may not even want to do it.
But sorry to interrupt you, Bob, but
No,
in
you're
those
not.
standards, but that gray area of standards can create
Sure.
a lot of legal issues. You know, if someone says, well, these people didn't meet the standard, I mean,
But the problem here is, from an employer standpoint, is like you don't have to live up to perfection when you're
Yeah.
doing these things. You just have to do some sort of
Due diligence.
Due diligence to make sure you're not just rushing the person
Right.
out, and so they can't say, "Oh, well, you did it for John, but not for Jill."
Yeah.
So what you do is you put a checklist down, you
Yeah.
do some training, you find out how your protocol is going to be. You have a post-accident screen. Whenever you have an accident, it's gonna,
Yeah.
a person's in a vehicle.
well,
If
you
a
should be
person-
following that anyways.
You should follow that. That doesn't have to be as observations. A person's in a vehicle, they run off the road, they hit something. It's you just send that person down for
Right.
testing. If there is, hey, I just heard that John is walking around and he's acting really weird. Well, that who knows what happened in John's life?
Yeah.
He might have had something going on personal. So you have to have.
And
some
weird,
sort
the
of
one
checklist.
person may be normal to somebody else.
Well, that's
Yeah,
true,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's the other thing about it is, was there a reason why that person all of a sudden now is being targeted? You know,
Yeah,
does he have an
yeah.
enemy that's
Yeah.
bringing it up? So that's why you do this neutral thing. So if you as an employer, you can have several things. You can have a random test, or you can have a for cause test, and of course you can have pre-employment screening and then post-accident screening. But if you do random testing means exactly what it means.
Yeah.
It means it's random. It means you
Right.
have a third party essentially that selects the person, sends them down. You don't do all these things. You get that completely out of here. If it's a for cause means you have to have good cause, a
Right.
good legitimate reason why. If you're in a non-union setting and you can just do it yourself, you try to put safety protocols in place, and very, I think, minimal research out there will help you put together a for cause mechanism where you watch the person observationally, you do the checklist. Maybe you have some training with your managers on an annual basis to make sure that they're up to speed on what it is we're looking for. Then you send them down for testing. If the testing confirms, then you can go ahead and move forward. If the person has a disability and they say they got a medical marijuana card, depending on where you're at in the country, you may have to go through an interactive process with that person. On the other hand, if you're in the state of Michigan, right now, as it is, they don't. Now, another component that comes into play sometimes, people don't think about this, some states, including Michigan, and this for medical marijuana specifically, the unemployment agency has said if the only reason why you're fired is because of a medical marijuana prescribed drug test, so you get a drug test that's positive and you've got a medical marijuana card, you generally will get your unemployment. Now the question is going to be,
And the difference is having the medical marijuana card.
That's right.
Versus
That's right.
just using it in a recreational.
but now we
setting.
don't know, because that's the next step. Because before, when that case came out, when those line of cases came out, we didn't have legal recreational marijuana. So the question is, will the state of Michigan's unemployment office extend that to say that's not a disqualifying event to stop you from having unemployment? And people say, well, what's the big deal? Do you get fired? Well, if you have more and more of your employees getting let go because of drug tests and getting unemployment, then your rates will go up potentially for your unemployment insurance. Your exposure goes higher. So there's another cost, an unintended cost of firing people. And that then pushes people to that question of, well, do I just let my policy go, or do I enforce my policy? Do I change my policy?
Yeah. Or do I stop enforcing the policy? But the question is this: is that are there going to be two standards? One for people who don't have the marijuana card, medical marijuana card, and people who do. So that's another question also.
But that marijuana card, in all honesty, I mean, come on. If any of you have been to any of the major festivals in Michigan, any one of us in this room or anybody can get a medical marijuana card. I can tell you, when I was at Arts Beats and Eats in Royal Oak, on every single block, literally every single block, they had a place with a doctor on site. Get your medical marijuana card here, and part of their advertising list or every single symptom that you could tell the doctor that you had, and he can sign off and say you qualify for medical marijuana, none of which could be
right, Bob,
tested on the spot.
Right, Bob, but that's not. And you're right. It's absolutely correct. In fact, that was 20 years ago when I was working in San Francisco and in L.A. and California. It was, especially in San Francisco. I mean, you could get everybody had medical marijuana cards. But the point of it is, how is that going to, how do you prove that someone just got it for a reason that wasn't serious? Or how did someone get it? Because I do know people who really need it and who have medical marijuana cards, and I know people who don't. But the thing about it is, how is that applied in a workplace setting? Does that make a difference?
And we really don't have the time, because what you have to do is there is a process that you have to go through to make that determination on whether somebody, if it's ever held to be a reasonable accommodation, that's going to be a problem for employers, because it's going to be no different than anybody else coming in with some other requirement. And a person with medical marijuana card, if that was required, it's going to be hard to say a person who was not observed to be impaired, was not causing an injury, was not causing any problems, if they simply just test positive on either a random test or a pre-employment screening test or whatever test they have, if they test positive at that point in time and you let them go and you don't engage in the interactive process with them, if they change and say it is a mandatory subject or an accommodation issue, you're going to be in trouble as an employer if you don't have the safeguards in place that you would for any other type of prescription drug.
Where do you see this going, Cliff? I mean, around the country and here in Michigan, where do you see this going?
I really think that it's going to stay the course of how employers enforce. I don't think there's going to be much different. I think what's going to change is the shrillness of the opposition to tests that are positive. I think it's the tone, but it's not the actual substance that's going to change. Substance-wise, I think the statement's already been made. And the statement is, if you're an employer with a reasonable, legitimate drug policy that's in place that says that you can't be under the influence of drugs, number one, and two, that if we have a drug system that doesn't say anything about influence, okay, because remember, it's hard to test marijuana.
Right.
If you simply have a drug test that says we take a 5-panel test, and if you test positive for one of the 5 panels, then that's subject to discharge. If you have a policy in place, generally speaking, I think that's going to be fine. And then if there is this requirement that you have to go through an interactive process with a person if they test positive, I think you just put that in there as you would for any other prescription drug. And I think it will pretty much stay the course. The only thing that's going to change is there's going to be a number of advocates that are going to continue to challenge these decisions, the marijuana decisions, the opiate decisions, all these things. I think that's really where the challenge is going to be. But I think society-wise, more states are going to open up recreational marijuana. More states are going to go medical marijuana. I think that's the real trend that you're going to see.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see it be big business. I think it's going to be a big revenue source. I think that the federal government's probably going to just relax eventually to ebb and flow. It's going to be more of a mainstay. But again, you can't drink on the job. Right. You can't. I mean, they have every time I watch the playoffs or the Super Bowl, guess what? I see beer ads all the time. Doesn't mean I can go and drink on the job. I can't be under the influence of alcohol. Same thing with marijuana. I think you're going to see prevalence, but still going to be restrictions.
Now, do you see that there's going to be a big difference between union shops and non-union shops as far as how they handle the drug issue?
Well, it depends, existing or non-existing. I mean, I think the existing union shops, again, have already done a good job. I think the drug policies are already in place. I think for the most part, when you go into a union shop, that battle that's been waged since the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Between labor, organized labor, and the drug perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's already been fought to a certain extent. You tweak it, but I think that battle's done. It's the new places, the places that are either relatively new just because they just opened up the shop or unionized where they haven't put that policy in place or they haven't worked. I think that's a battleground. And I think the grievances and arbitrations will always fight
and
back
do you see this being part of the unions?
Sure.
How they convincing people to, because if you have a place that's really strict on how they handle the, drug testing and everything else, you see this as and I can see it, but seeing unions coming in and this being part of their, hey, let's, this is another reason why you need to, sign a union card, man, and vote for the union.
Listen, anything to get the sale done, right?
Yeah,
whatever it takes to sell,
that's
sell.
You know what's funny, Rick? I've heard both. I've heard, we'll protect you. You know what? Everyone here wants to do drugs. Don't worry about it. We'll protect you. And I've heard the opposite, that safety is more important, and we're going to put
Well, yeah, I mean, the unions.
I mean,
the
they're gonna-
unions. I mean, they're going to say what they have to say to make their case to. I mean, as the case comes, if you have people who want that, they're going to say, hey, this is what we can do.
We did that job in Manistee where over 50% of that place was actively high on the job during the entire time we were up there. They had no policy in place. We couldn't change it. And the unions were telling them, don't worry about it, guys. Nothing's going to change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen it both ways. It is kind of crazy, and I agree with you, Cliff.
So Cliff, you would say that for moving forward, companies, to protect themselves, they need to establish these policies. They need to upgrade, their handbooks to give them protection as these laws come in.
I think you need to take this seriously because it is something that's changing. So what you need to do is, on a yearly basis, I always say, get your policies out and review them.
Well, the laws have been changing so much over the last couple of years, and depending on what happens in 2020. God, that sounds strange. 2020. See what's going to happen in 2020.
Right.
We may have a change of administrations also. So a lot of these things, I mean, over the last couple of years, we've been talking about handbooks, policies, the labor laws, the NLRB, and everything else. So it's been, like a roller coaster ride over the last couple of years. May change again in 2020. Who knows? But employers have to be ready for this. I mean, they can't take their handbooks. Policies for granted anymore. Are you seeing a lot of your clients coming to you and saying, hey, we need to look at our handbooks. We need to, do they realize how important this is?
Since the Fair Labor Standards Act was going to double the salary threshold for somebody to be exempt, I think the floodgates have been open for employers to say, it's time to start looking at some of these policies. Because things are changing so fast on a state and a federal level and at an administrative level. When Obama was in, he made a dramatic number of changes. Administrative-wide, they really targeted a bunch of industries. And so when you do that, you got to look at your handbook. And so that's what happened. Trump comes in. He's changing things. So people who said, I want to do this, I'm going to do this because I have to, are saying now, do I have to do that anymore? And so now they're releasing it. And I don't think it's going to stop. And I think at 2020, no matter what happens, at the state and the federal level, we're having so many changes, whether it be for wages, whether it be for policies regarding drug testing, whether it be policies regarding safety requirements, notices and postings and discrimination. And there's just so many things that are changing. I mean, the biggest difference right now compared to 8 years ago, 10 years ago, is the number of state level rules and laws that you have to comply with. It's amazing. This is just another one. This drug testing issue falls on the heels of, you go to New York State and you go to California and then you go to Texas and you can see the handbooks and you will see that they're night and day different because each one requires different requirements. Not only is it wages, but who's protected and how do you notify people of their protections and what's going on with drugs and what's going on with different classifications and how do you let somebody go? What notification do you have to give a person when you change work comp carrier? Every state's got its own rules. Yeah. And this is going to continue to go on. And if you don't keep on top of it, again, people could have run a business for 30 years and never changed their handbook and probably been okay for the most part. But now that's not the case.
Right, and hopefully employers are seeing that the expense of keeping their handbooks up to date is a tangible expense.
Yeah, I think it's something.
Yeah. The thing about it is that what I keep on telling clients, and we've had this discussion, many times, that because we have a more conservative board right now, don't get comfortable with that because it's going to change, and it may change next year. It may change in 2 years. Who knows? But you can't be comfortable with that. You always have to do the training. You always have to stay on top of on issues in your handbooks and the laws and everything else. It's very, very important to do that. Don't get relaxed because we have a more conservative board right now. You have to be prudent in how you handle these issues because it's going to affect you. And if you let things go, like you said, you're right. We have clients, and we've discussed this before, Cliff and Bob, that we have clients who haven't changed their handbook in 10, 20, 30 years.
Sure.
And don't see why it's important to do so, because they're just ignorant about the laws that are changing. But I think it's moving forward. It's essential that companies.
Well,
stay
think
on
about
top
it
of
for a second. So, I mean, it wasn't that long ago Trump comes in office, and one of the first things they talk about is we're going to clamp down on marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have an election, and the voters in different states have said, "Oh, well, we're expanding the right to have marijuana." It doesn't. You have to look at a micro and macro level. Things are more dynamic than they've ever been.
Mm-hmm.
These types of initiatives, like voter-driven initiative, labor-driven initiatives, the Fight for 15, minimum wage, what you have to pay tipped employees. I mean, these things are changing at a state level so fast.
Right,
It's
and they're taking a life of their own, taking on a life of their own. If you remember, SEIU went and started initially pushed the Fight for 15. Mm-hmm. They basically pulled all the financial support out of it, but it goes on.
Huh?
It goes on, and it's taking a life of its own. So just because the union started, then they moved out, doesn't mean that the movement doesn't continue to go on. And once again, it's one of these social movements that take a life of their own.
We kind of got to wrap it up. We're out of time here, but I do want to pose Cliff with one more question.
Sure.
I want to make an observation and see if you're seeing the same thing. Now, Rick and I talked to attorneys all across the country. And one of the things that we're hearing, and it's kind of startling, is how many companies are willingly and knowingly just saying, let them do what they want to do. If they smoke dope, they smoke dope. Whether it's on the job, off the job, if we catch them, we catch them. If we don't, we don't. A very lackadaisical approach to it. Are you kind of hearing the same thing here in Michigan?
Well, quite honestly, I hear both and have heard both for years. I mean, it's all goes down to who you are, what you do, and what your workplace is made up of. I've heard for years people say, I don't care. I need the job done. If I get the job done, I don't care unless you screw something up. In other words, if you damage something or you hurt somebody, then I'm going to test you and then I'm going to flunk you out. But I don't really care what you do on your free time or during the work or off work. I got other places that say, I can't have people coming in here if they're smelling like marijuana. I don't care if you're doing it. I don't care if you're under the influence or not. You walk in this door, you do it. I'm going to send you down for testing. I'm going to test you every chance, every time I can, because either one, I don't like it, or two, I don't want it to become a problem. That's not going to change. That's not going to change.
The final question is this. An employer knows and willingly lets their employees drink on the job, use drugs on the job, and they get severely hurt. Who's on the line?
Well, most states, the workers' compensation statute, the good news for the employer is will cap some of the damages, but your work comp rates will go up. If it's a third party that comes in, like say a customer comes in or a vendor comes in and they don't work for you, then the company is going to be looking at a potential serious lawsuit if they get hurt for that.
Especially if someone else gets hurt that's not doing the drugs, and you let it slide. Someone's drunk or they're high on the job, and you haven't enforced any regulations, and a third party gets hurt.
Yeah, and if it's willful, and I mean, if it's known that the person's out there high and endangering people for a long period of time, and you go, we're not going to mess with it, then you could be on, even for an employee, you could still have a tortious liability. So, I mean, there's some big damages out there that are sitting around. I mean, that's the problem. At the end of the day, when you're in business, you make a gamble. Every day you make risks. Every day you make decisions. And that's why you say, I don't see trends. What I see different types of trends that go on. What's more trendy than others, and sometimes ebbs and flows. But what you see is you have employers who are safety conscious. They're risk averse. People who are risk averse always say, let's just have a policy. Let's just test it. Let's just go ahead. I'd rather err on the side of having one person sue me for me firing them for having a test that's positive than a person sue me for being hurt because I look the other way. And I got other people saying the opposite. I just need heads in the door. I need bodies. I don't care. I'll get sued. That's why I have insurance. So it all depends on where your mindset is.
Yeah. So, like I said, we're out of time. The way I see it, we got a lot of things to work through 2020, at least here in Michigan. I personally believe that other states will be following suit. So this is something that we're going to keep our eye on for a while. So with that said, Cliff, Rick, thanks again for joining us on PSLabor Talk. See you next time.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, thanks.